Merry Christmas, Lake Point. Pastor Michael here to get you caught up on the first week of our series, The Christmas Tree. It's based on Matthew chapter 1, which lists the genealogy of Jesus, which in many ways was the very first Christmas tree. It's kind of weird, for Matthew to introduce the Christmas story to us in this way with a list of names, but he does so because he wants us to see all the ornaments on Jesus' family tree. Now, when I say ornaments, I'm referring to the people, the names of Jesus' relatives and ancestors, dating all the way back thousands of years earlier to the time of Abraham. Each of these ornaments tells a story, and it points to a reason why Jesus came. As Nate shared on Sunday, about a third of the way down the very first Christmas tree, we see a woman listed by the name of Ruth. Ruth's a fascinating character because she needed God's grace to help her get through a difficult season, a season of despair. There's an entire book of the Old Testament devoted to her story. It's only 4 chapters long. It's a story about grief and loss and pain, but it's also a story about comfort and hope and change. The story begins with a man and his wife Naomi and their 2 sons who are living in Israel, but due to a severe and sudden famine, the man decides to move his family to a neighboring country that was an enemy of Israel, the nation of Moab. He does this in hopes that he can provide for his family and give them a better future. But after settling into this new country, read that the man dies, leaving his wife and his 2 boys alone. To make a long story short, the boys marry a Moabite woman, but then the unthinkable happens and both sons die as well. So now Naomi is living in this foreign land with just her 2 daughters-in-law, having no reason to remain. Naomi decides to move back to her hometown in Israel, but she tells her daughters-in-law that they can stay there as, Moab is their home country. And after such a tragic loss of losing both their husbands and in the prime of their lives, Naomi certainly doesn't expect them to uproot themselves at her expense. The problem, however, is that without any children to take care of her, there will be no one to provide and protect Naomi as she gets older, which compels her daughter-in-law Ruth to say these now famous words: "Wherever you go, I will go. Wherever you live, I will live. Your people will be my people, and your God will be my God. Wherever you die, I will die, and there I too will be buried." Talk about a deep love and devotion to another person. And so Ruth returns with Naomi to Naomi's hometown, and both of these women are filled with grief and sadness. In fact, we read that in Naomi's case, she is filled with bitterness, bitter with the way that life has turned out for her, bitter with how things have gone, bitter with the loss of her husband, the loss of her boys, the loss of her hopes and dreams. And maybe you can relate. Sometimes life can be unfair. Maybe for you it hasn't been the loss of a loved one. Maybe for you it's been the loss of your health, or the loss of your marriage, the loss of your job, or the loss of your dreams. And so maybe you've tried to shake it off by drinking away those feelings, or covering them up with some sort of addiction, or replacing them with someone or something new in your life. But that doesn't usually work. The reason why is because all of us need something beyond ourselves, beyond our own strength, to help us deal with life's disappointments. And that's where the Christmas story comes into play. The great truth about Christianity is that we worship a God who fully understands our pain and our suffering. Because the God that we worship, he did not stay in heaven. He took on flesh and he lived among us. He walked in our shoes, not only to reveal his love and character to us, but also so that he could feel our pain, so that he could know our suffering. That's why Jesus came to earth and lived among us. In doing so, Jesus experienced all the same things that we experience. Jesus knows what it's like to go without. He was born to a very poor mother and father, parents who didn't even have enough money to pay for the sacrifice of a lamb at the birth of their son, so they had to sacrifice 2 doves. Jesus knows what it's like to lose a parent. Most scholars believe Joseph died while Jesus was a teenager, leaving Jesus to care for his mother. Jesus knew what it's like to be misunderstood and let down by family. His mother and brothers were ready to have him committed when he began his ministry because they thought he had lost it. Jesus knows what it's like to feel betrayed, abandoned, and alone. His closest friends deserted him in his greatest time of need. Jesus also knows what it's like to be treated unfairly. His own people, the people he came to save, nailed him to a cross. Jesus knows what it's like to endure physical pain. He experienced one of the most excruciating deaths possible. Jesus faced all the same hardships and challenges that we do. It's why the writer of Hebrews gives us these wonderful words of encouragement found in Hebrews chapter 4, verse 15 and 16. He says, Jesus understands humanity, for as a man, our magnificent king priest was tested in every way just as we are. And so let's come boldly to the throne of our gracious God. There we will receive his mercy and we'll find grace to help us when we need it most. The writer of Hebrews is saying that Jesus sits at the right hand of God, and because Jesus knows what it's like to be human, to experience pain and disappointment, we can go to God with confidence. It's no accident that Jesus was born into our world. And this is such wonderful news, that the God of the universe knows what it's like to be human. He relates to and understands our pain. But friends, as Nate shared, that's only half the good news. The other thing that we are reminded of as we study Ruth and as we look at her ornament hanging on the family tree of Jesus is that God isn't finished writing your story. I mean, consider the rest of Ruth's story. Ruth and Naomi, they return to Naomi's hometown and they're heartbroken. They're grieving the loss of their husbands. They're filled with pain, disappointment, and bitterness. But back in Naomi's hometown, they begin to experience redemption. It was a small town that had little significance at the time, but since then has become quite famous. You've probably heard of it because it was none other than the town of Bethlehem. And it's there in Bethlehem that Ruth, this outsider, this Moabite widow, an enemy of Israel, meets and falls in love with a man named Boaz. And Boaz redeems her. He takes her as his own. He takes her as his wife, and the two have a child. And what we read is that they name him Obed, and he became the father of Jesse and the grandfather of David. David, as in King David, as in the guy who slew Goliath and later became Israel's greatest leader. It's an incredible story of how God takes this widow from this pagan country and he makes her the great grandmother of King David. Now, that alone is a pretty good story, but it gets even better because from the family line of King David comes Jesus, the Savior of the world. God takes a story which seems hopeless and broken, and he brings about more good from it than Ruth could have ever imagined. Why? Because that's what God does. That's what God specializes in. God doesn't just empathize with our pain. He takes our pain and makes something beautiful out of it. Well, friends, thanks for listening. Enjoy jumping into discussion questions. I'll see you next time.